Okay, so I want to welcome everyone to the fourth in a continuing series of shiurim on the Yud Gimel Ikkarim, the 13 principles of faith of the Rambam, Maimonides. And last week we were discussing actually the Yesod HaSheni, and we spoke about it in relation to the Yesod HaShlishi. The question that we raised was why, in fact, actually the order of the principles. Yesod HaSheni, why should it precede Yesod HaShlishi, since Yesod HaSheni would, in fact, imply very directly Yesod HaShlishi. But I tried to give an explanation for that last time, and we came to an important principle in the Rambam. Whether it explains the order, then I leave it to usually say leave it to the reader, and I leave it to the viewer, or the listener. But the very interesting relationship that is a very important theme of the Rambam between what we would call negative theology, in other words, the unknowability of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is the inability to describe him in any positive terms, and between human ethics. We see that this is a theme in several places in the Rambam speaks about it in the first section. He speaks about the dialogue between Moshe Rabbeinu and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and he reiterates this in he reiterates this at the very end of the Moreh Nevuchim I. But what is this conceptual relationship? In other words, it's very, very nice that we have several places where the Rambam connects the two ideas, but why is there a philosophical connection between the two ideas? It just can't be that they coincidentally happen to appear together, appear together in Scripture. So I thought that maybe I would elucidate that concept in a little bit more detail. And to this I want to actually turn to chapters 68 and 69, which are actually towards the end of the first section of the Moreh Nevuchim I, the Guide for the Perplexed. Now, it's interesting that the Rambam has told us that one cannot describe God in any way possible. In other words, there's no... the Rambam says that really in Yesod HaSheni he's one, but his one is actually not a concept of oneness, of unity that we use in any commonplace setting. And in addition to that, the Rambam says in Yesod HaShlishi that we can't describe we can't describe HaKadosh Baruch Hu in any way. It brings psukim, al mis tatamyun ve'eshve, al mis tatamyun kel. And the Rambam actually goes through the entire section of the chapters that deal with negative theology, and comes to this very, very important conclusion that in fact HaKadosh Baruch Hu is basically defies any type of description. It's very typical in the Rambam that after he makes a point, and hammers the point over and over again, that after a few chapters of Hesach Hadas, he actually contradicts himself. This is very common in the Moreh Nevuchim I. And of course in all these cases we have to always ask Dar Sheni. But this happens, believe it or not, in negative theology. Where does it happen in negative theology? In chapter 68, in the Schwartz edition, which I have in front of me, it's actually... obviously it's Perek Samach and Chelek Aleph, page 173. But in page 175 and 176 there, towards the end of chapter 68, the Rambam is speaking about how God knows. When we say HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows something, how does he know? So the Rambam says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there's no distinction between the knower, the object of knowledge, and the act of knowing. They're all one. Actually, the Rambam actually mentions this also in Perek Hey, in Hilchos Tshuva. That's where some of you probably know this from. But actually, he goes into a lot of detail and speaking about that in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who is always thinking, always actively thinking. So therefore, in fact, the Hu Seichel V'Poel Tamid. I'm reading page 176. Mischayev, since HaKadosh Baruch Hu is always actively thinking, Mischayev, therefore, right, as a consequence of that, Shiahu, that he, with a capital H, V'Oisai Dover, the object of his knowledge, hamusar, davar echad. V'hu atzmusai. Because Baruch is a Kodesh Baruch Seichel is his essence. Upulas hasaka atzma, asher bahu koi maskil, hu etzem ha-seichel shu atzmusai. In other words, the act of apprehension, in fact, is actually the essence of God. L'chein hu seichel, maskil, umuskal li'olam. So in other words, the Rambam is telling us what God is. God is intellect. I thought you can't describe God. He's intellect. Now, what's amazing is that this doesn't only apply to God. It applies to man. Of course, man is not always thinking. Okay? Some people never think. But in other words, some people think when they're actively thinking. And the Rambam says, in the next paragraph on page 176, Bora eifo sheyos haseichel v'amaskel v'amuskel echad b'mispar ein legabi aboya bilvad. This concept that the seichel, the intellect, the maskil, the intellector v'amuskal, and the intellected, right? Ein legabi aboya bilvad. This is not that they won. Is not only a property of the Creator, because Baruch Hu. El legabi kol seichel. The property of every seichel, every person who thinks. 1 second, let me just finish. Gambanu hamaskil ha-seichel va-muskal im davar echad. Respect to us also too. The maskil, the person thinking, ha-seichel, the intellect, ha-muskal, the object of the object that's being intellectualized. Im davar echad, they're one. Kasher yesh lanu seichel v'poyel. In other words, we're thinking. Everything you say about a Kodesh Baruch Hu, I was going to say Kiviyachol, but the Rambam is not saying Kiviyachol. You could say about man when he actively thinks. That's what the Rambam is saying. Okay? However, so what's the difference between man and God? There has to be a difference. So the Rambam says, but sometimes we're not thinking. In other words, if we're thinking, so the act of thinking is actually, of man, is actually similar to that of Kodesh Baruch Hu, of God. But since sometimes we're not thinking, sometimes we're sleeping, sometimes we think we're thinking, but we're not thinking. But in any case, that is in fact actually what the Rambam says. So it's very interesting, is we get here actually 2 points of interest. Point number 1 is the essence of God is seichel. We can speak about God thinking, which is very interesting. After you get to think about God, but the Rambam actually goes in detail about God thinking. So you might say, oh, he's the thinker, the act of thinking, the object of thought. Well, that's one we can't think about. That's not true. Says the Rambam, just like I describe God thinking, I describe man thinking. So this seems to be a very blatant contradiction to the negative theology. We are describing an act of God, and the Rambam is making the point of this in the very same way as we describe the very act in man. That's what the Rambam is saying. Okay, now, it turns out that this is the only activity or attribute which the Rambam not describes God, but actually defines as God's essence. And this is actually at the end of chapter 69. The chapter after chapter 68 is chapter 69 in the first section. And the Swatch edition.
There's no problem with that thinking.
Wait. Let's go. Let me just finish up and then we'll ask questions, okay? And page 180, right? I don't know what there's a problem with. Rambam just told me I can't describe God, and it turns out he did describe God. I don't know what's the problem.
He described his action there.
Okay, let's.
Let's
leave the kasha. The kasha is, the Rambam has devoted several chapters to telling me that I cannot describe God. And now he just described God. He described his essence. He described him in great detail. In fact, he said the same description of God, same description of man. That's what the Rambam says. Okay? You have a table, it's very good. Okay, but now I think it's a kasha. Now, let's go to chapter 69, to the end of 69. The Rambam here speaks about God's will. Right? And the Rambam says the same thing too applies to God's will. Right? And here in page 69 the Rambam says, the will of God. Right? So the Rambam says, okay, and Rambam compares it with Tzonei v'Chachmasai. In other words, God's will and God's wisdom. Asher L'gabehem huvhar, with respect to both God's will and God's wisdom, it has been clarified, says the Rambam, explicated, Lefi Datenu, Shehem Atzmus, they also constitute his essence. Right? God's will and wisdom are not things that are separate from his essence, but rather they constitute his essence. Therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the tachlis achrona, is the purpose of everything. So therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the tachlis, the purpose of everything. And says the Rambam, Kamochen, similarly, tachlis hakol. Therefore, the purpose, since the HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the tachlis of everything, is the purpose of everything. HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes to the purpose of everything. Because we ask a person, why did this happen? So we'd say that's what he wanted. So the purpose of everything is the will of God. So says the Rambam, Kamochen, therefore, similarly, tachlis hakol, the purpose of everything, is to imitate him. In other words, since the HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the tachlis, the purpose of everything, so therefore, then the purpose of everything is what? To imitate God, to be like HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And this is the meaning of God's will. What is the meaning of God's will? That a person is supposed to, right? Ashehu atzmusai. What does it mean that God's will is his essence? That a person is supposed to imitate God's will. Do like HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the Rambam says, Kifi sheyuvhar, as will be explained. Now, where does the Rambam explain this? In my humble opinion, he explains this at the very end of the Moreh Nevuchim. At the end of chapter 54, in the third section of the Moreh Nevuchim. And there, the Rambam brings the pasuk in Yirmiyahu. Actually, he brings the pasuk of Moshe Rabbeinu, which the Rambam spoke about. Hodiani nas d'rachecha. Right? Rosh Hashanah HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that he should reveal to him his ways. Right? And then he brings the pasuk in Yirmiyahu. Ani Hashem oiseh chesed mishpat tzedakah ba'aretz. Right? I am God who does chesed u'mishpat u'tzedakah. Right? Charity and justice and goodwill in the world. Achreichen, after that, the pasuk continues, says, Ki be'elech hafatzinu mesha. This is what I want. This is what I desire. This is my will. But Terasi, Shiu Bekem, was HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, what I want from you, I want from you that you do chesed, right? Righteousness, mishpat, justice, stock, and charity, ba'aretz. Ba'ofen shuvhanu, like we explained in the Shloshas Midas, which there the Rambam introduces in negative theology. Hatachla she'oisa, tziyim b'pasuk zehu eifo, shu hivir, she'shleimus ha'adam sheba, yispar be'emes, the true shleimus, the perfection that a person should aspire to, he mishi yigil lahazik as a kilyas ale, kifi yacholto, a person to try to apprehend God in accordance with his ability, negative theology, right? Right? In other words, a person should try to apprehend God to the highest level, which according to Rambam means to understand ultimately why you can't apprehend God. In other words, the highest level of apprehension of God is that you should know fundamentally why you cannot apprehend God. This is negative theology. That the Rambam spoke about in chapter 59, the first section. La'acha oisei hasaga, after a person reaches this apprehension that he cannot apprehend HaKadosh Baruch Hu, oisei adam yiskaven behisnahagusai tamid, then a person, right, should intend in his actions, right, all the time, to chesed mishpat u'tzedakah, to the ethics of chesed mishpat u'tzedakah, right? Chesed, which is righteousness, mishpat, justice, and tzedakah, and charity, b'toich hidamos el ma'asav yis'aleh, by imitating the acts of God, kamosh yizbanu mispa pa'am b'sefer zeh. It's interesting. The Rambam is, first of all, saying exactly. Well, I mean, I was trying to say what the Rambam was saying, but now the Rambam was saying exactly what I said, which was what the Rambam was saying, is that the Rambam says that when a person contemplates HaKadosh Baruch Hu and reaches to the point where the highest level of apprehension, which is to understand why what? why I can't apprehend God, then the next stage in this activity is to understand that the only thing I can do is really imitate him. In other words, something which I cannot apprehend, I can only imitate. That's what the Rambam is saying. And therefore, by imitating him, I'm imitating him in accordance with his will, with his what? With his acts of chesed, mitzvah, his ethics. And by doing that, right, I become ethical in the way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was ethical. In other words, the contemplation of the incomprehensibility of God inevitably leads a person to the conclusion, or to the understanding of it, that all he can do is imitate his acts, which means ethical acts. Yeah.
So, how is it that I'm able to imitate something that I can't comprehend?
Okay, but anyway, we're gonna speak. We're gonna get to this one second. But what I'm saying is, we'll see. We'll speak about this. But we see over here that the Rambam is actually making here a very, very important philosophical connection. In other words, the philosophical connection that I'm making is, and what's implying is that if I can in fact contemplate and describe God, I will never come to imitate him. In other words, the fact that the ultimate purpose of man is to imitate God is a consequence of the fact that he cannot contemplate him objectively, ontologically. In other words, the undoing or the inability of ontology, right, results in ethical action. Ethical action comes about that something which I cannot contemplate objectively, I can only imitate. That's what the Rambam seems to be saying. Now, what is this connection? Why is this connection? Well, before we speak about that, I just want to answer this contradiction that I asked. I answered a question in the negative theology. We said we can't describe God, but how can we describe God's essence, describe God as thinking, or describe God as having a will? The answer is very simple. We're not describing God. We're being like God. In other words, when I say God's essence is his thinking, what I really mean is that I think like God thinks, which is actually what the Ram defines as the image of God, Son of Elohim. In other words, basically, the contemplation that God's thought, that the thinker and the object thought are one, just in fact is another way of saying is that I think like God. In other words, my thinking like God, right, is that which is the direct consequence of my understanding of God's thinking, which is that the thinker, the act of thought, and the act of thinking are actually one and the same. So in other words, what the Rambam describes as God's essence, or those things like God's will, or God's wisdom, which is describing God's essence, what the Rambam is really saying is that they're not God's essence in an ontological sense, but that man wills like God wills, and that he thinks like God thinks, and therefore, in fact, man is directed not to think of God, but to be like God, which means to think like God. That's Tzelem Elokim. And in fact, to will like God, which is ethics. That's God's ethics. Now, so, in other words, the point of this is that negative theology means there's no truth in my there's no truth in there's no object of knowledge which I can posit as the truth of God. If there's no knowledge of the truth of God, so what is the truth of God? It's not objective knowledge. It can only be the way in which I imitate him. It can only be the human act, the act of ethics. In other words, when there's no object that I can focus on and describe, so I'm at the brim. So what am I left with? Something which I can't focus on is probably because it defines the entirety of the way I am. And as a result of that, the negative theology, right, a consequence of negative theology is that what I'm left with is just imitatio Dei. I'm imitating God in the way I think and the way I act. That's according to the Rambam. What the Rambam is saying is that the philosophical consequence of negative theology is precisely because since I cannot contemplate philosophically the ontology, what is God, the only thing I'm left with is to act like Him. And the Rambam is saying is this is the actual deep, what I would say, the Rambam is saying is, this is in fact actually the very, very deep message of the negative theology. So, what's interesting is that we've explained, we've seen in the Rambam, very deeply, that the halacha l'maaseh, the Yesod HaSheni, is that man is called on not to intellectualize God, and not to understand God intellectually, but to be like God. And that's the Yesod HaSheni. Now, I want to make one question.
just a clarification. Two things. First of all, negative theology is the third Ikkarim, not the second Ikkarim.
No, negative theology. When I think negative theology in the ultimate, Yesod HaSheni, that means that God. Negative theology means I can't describe God in any way whatsoever. He's one. When I'm saying negative theology, I'm speaking in the highest sense.
You mean Yichud Hashem?
Yichud Hashem, right? God's unity, which is undescribable.
Everything you've been saying now has been Yichud Hashem.
Right, Yichud Hashem, right.
Okay. And number two...
But no, Yichud Hashem is also part of negative theology. That's explained last week. That's chapter 58. Right, yeah.
And can I just repeat that the sentence before last, that we can't understand God, therefore we must be like God.
Right.
That doesn't make sense in English like that.
Okay, let me try to explain it in a different way, if that's possible. Okay? Let's assume it's just like this. Let's assume I'm trying to reach a goal. Let's say reach a goal. For example, it's interesting that the lashon of, let's say, of some of the mechaberim is that, to take a peek at what Kadosh Baruch Hu is called ratz v'shoiv. Nefesh Chaim speaks about this in Shar Gimel, the Tzimtzum. Like, you look at it and you run away. You peek and you run away. What do you mean peek and you run away? So I want to say the fact is that there are certain concepts that you can go near them, but it's like almost like a limit in calculus. You can go near them, but you never get there. And you're constantly returning to it. For example, a limit in calculus. You're trying getting there, and so what's a limit in calculus? And actually, if you look at the way calculus is described, you never describe the limit. What you do is you say that for each epsilon there's something like below that epsilon. So in other words, the limit of calculus is not an object, it's an activity. For every epsilon, it's a less than epsilon. You're constantly getting closer and closer. In other words, in negative theology, what does it mean to say to come to the fundamental understanding or the great apprehension of negative theology? It would be that as a person moves and comes to any concept of God, he dismisses it, he negates it, because God is higher than that. It's like God's unity. Right? Ramchal speaks about in Das Tavunais that what's God's unity? The God's unity really implies that once I have two things which seem not like each other, that actually expands God's unity, because God's unity is capable of incorporating things which are totally dichotomous, totally opposite. In other words, the more I think of things as being dichotomous, the more I come to God's unity. So in other words, negative theology is like a philosophical limit. In other words, the more, it's a process. It's a process of basically negating any possible concept which I might think is an ultimate concept, and negating that. So therefore, what I think about is, what is negative theology? It's not a concept, it's a process. That process is an act of thinking. In other words, any process which tries to understand things that ultimately can't do, you can never understand the concept. You can only think about the concept and close to it. So in other words, the understanding of the concept is really a process. In other words, it's an understanding of understanding. Something which cannot be understood is to understand why I can't understand it. To understand why I can't understand it, that's understanding the act of thinking. That's what I would say.
How does that lead me to be imitate there? How does that lead me to do chesed, to do...
Wait. No, so therefore, what do we see? We see is if I try to conceive of God, let's say God's unity, right? So, or let's say God's wisdom, it's beyond it, because everything I can think of, God's wisdom must be greater than that. So therefore, that's called the act of thinking. Now, if I try to think of what is God's will. So, for example, the Rambam says in chapter 13, section 3, what is the purpose of everything? She says, let's say the purpose of the world is man. But what's the purpose of man? The purpose of man is to do mitzvahs. What's the purpose of the mitzvahs? The Rambam in chapter 13 of section 3 takes you through the same process. Whenever I come to a purpose of something, I say, well, what's the purpose of that? So it turns out that it's a never-ending cycle. So when I think about what's God's will, there's nothing I can call God's will, because at every point when I define God's will, there's a what? I can say, well, why did he will that? So in other words, God's will is also a type of a process. So in other words, God's will is a process. So in other words, something like God's will, I can get the essences, it's a process describing God's will. So since it's a process, what is this process? The process is just doing God's will, imitating God. In other words, the will of God is not something which I can understand, but it's the purpose of everything. So when I contemplate God's will, I just have to do God's will because it's an activity. It's not something I can define. And what is this activity? This activity is an act of ethics. Does that make it a little bit clearer?
That explains thinking. How's it to chesed?
Chesed means because if I look to try to understand what is the purpose of everything, right? What is God's purpose? The Rambam says God is the purpose of everything.
Chesed mishpat tzedakah.
Right.
I understand thinking, but I don't understand how that.
Okay, first of all, let's try it again. Let's try it again.
Why didn't you?
Wait. I can't answer three questions at once. Okay, let's try it again. Okay, now Rambam says that if I cannot understand God, well, let's see if we do this simply. Let's go according to Moreh Nevuchim over here in 54. If I can't understand God, that means God is not an object which I can what? Which I can apprehend. Right? So there's only the act of apprehension. Whereas man can only apprehend like God apprehends. So it would come out that if I want to know God's will, it would be the same thing too. God's will is like any apprehension of God. I can't apprehend God's will. So it would argue by analogy. Just like apprehending God's essence is just God's thought would be thinking like God. So therefore apprehending God's will would just be like doing God's will. In other words, God's will cannot ultimately be apprehended. Anything which can't be apprehended, my only choice is what? Is activating it, is doing that. In other words, if I can't apprehend God's will, I can only do the act of thinking. So therefore, if God's will is not something which can be apprehended, what am I left to do? It's only...
Why is it not an intellectual?
What?
Why is it not an intellectual exercise still? Why does it lead me to act ethically?
I'm made to act ethically because since God's will is in one with God, in the way that God's intellect is one with God, and therefore the only thing I can do is think, so therefore too, since God's will is in one with God, I can never apprehend, the only way to apprehend God's will is to will. But what is God's will? What is God's will? It's ethics. Ethics is God's will. What is will? Will is acting in accordance with the way God Baruch Hu wants me to act. That's God's will.
Why does there have to be a will, and why does there have to be this
Wisdom? Because the Rambam says. That's what's running from the Rambam. That's the Rambam says.
You're saying that
you can disagree with the Rambam, but this is what the Rambam says.
the Rambam says God has a will and God thinks.
There's God's chachma's wisdom, the way he thinks, and there's God's will. So the Rambam says like this:
Okay.
just like in the act of thinking, I can only think like God. I can't contemplate God. I can only think like God. So in the case of God's will, I can't apprehend God's will. I can only will like God. What does it mean, will like God? It means when God wants to do something, I have to want to do things that God does. What does God want to do? He wants to be ethical. So therefore I have to be ethical like God. I think that's the way he explains it. That's what I'm saying in the Rambam. In other words, what the Rambam is saying is the definition of negative theology is something which I cannot ultimately apprehend. I have no choice but to imitate God. So, because I can never come to an end of understanding God's ultimate will. So just like in thought, there's just an act of thinking, I can never come to the end. So in will, there's just an act of will. What's called an act of willing? An act of willing is to will like God wills. Just like I think the way God thinks, I have to will like God wills. In other words, the Rambam is arguing, maybe it's better, by analogy. In other words, God's will is like God's thought. God's thought leads me to an act of thinking, and therefore, consequently, God's will leads me to an act of willing. What's an act of willing? An act of doing things, of willing what God wants to will. Just like I think the way God wants me to think. What's called willing and doing things the way God wills things, that's called ethics. I think that the Rambam is saying like that.
Is there some separate place where the Rambam says, I don't know what God does, what God is, I don't know why he does what he does, but I see the result of what he does.
No, he doesn't say that. So my knowledge, he doesn't. We see the way he acts, I'm supposed to imitate God's
we
acts.
do see the way he acts.
Yes, we said, the Rambam says, he does chesed, he does mishpat, does tzedakah, the Rambam speaks about...
So
But
right now, we know he does that because the Rambam...
No, the Rambam says... He
tells us.
There's a psukim in Yirmiyahu.
Okay.
Right,
Okay.
And also, too, there's a Gemara in Tzayta, Kodesh Baruch Hu's Menachem Avelim, he does chesed, etc., etc. In other words, what the Rambam is saying is, negative theology means that my relationship to God cannot be one of comprehension, but rather, one of imitation.
What we're left with what
Right.
see God doing.
We're not see what we have to imitate God. That's the point here. You can't see God.
Okay.
God is invisible. I mean, it's negative theology. But I'm saying is I have to imitate God. In other words, the Rambam is saying in the same way that we've decided that what is God's essence in thought, that means the act of thinking. So therefore, in the same way, God's essence is will means I have to will like God wills. It doesn't mean will what God wills. It means I have to want to do the same thing that God does. What does the God do? He does chesed, mishpat, and tzedakah. That's what the Rambam is saying. Okay, I want to go further because I think this is about the best I can explain it. Okay? Yeah.
Is it because we're left with we can't apprehend, so therefore we have to imitate, or is it because by imitating that will help us to apprehend in a more integrated way?
No, I don't think so. Because we can't apprehend. We can never apprehend. In other words, that's I think what the Rambam is saying. The Rambam is saying is something which is infinite, which I can never hope to apprehend. The most I can do is to get closer, which is a type of imitation. But after the Rambam as to answer your question, he's arguing by analogy, right? If you understand the case of thinking, so now by an invariance principle, we'll transfer to the act of will, because Rambam has already said that God's essence is also his will, which means his will is not separate from he is, and therefore because of that, just like the God's essence of essence of thought, right, makes a demand on man's act of thinking. The good man imitates. Man thinks he imitates God. The same thing with God's will. That's I think is certainly one could say to understand the Rambam. Okay, now, I want to go a little bit further. Okay, but I want to go further. Now that we've explained a little bit about the relationship of the negative theology, I think philosophically this is the best I can do in the Rambam. I'm sure that people who probably can do it better. Right now, this is the best I can do in the Rambam. But I think now we have something very, very important and fundamental. And the fundamental thing is that the Yesod Hasheni, God's unity, right, which is that which was not shown to Moshe Rabbeinu, but Moshe Rabbeinu reaches the highest level, madrega, in apprehending what is God's unity, what is not God's unity, right? So therefore, immediately after this, Moshe Rabbeinu is shown the Yud Gimel Midas HaRachamim, and that's what the Rambam is saying here. After I apprehend the God to the best of my ability, which means the best ability to apprehend why I can't apprehend God, then immediately says the Rambam, right? I should look to imitate him, strive to imitate him. And that's really the end of the Moreh Nevuchim, which is 54. That's the end of the Moreh Nevuchim. That's the purpose. That's the tachlis of everything. So in other words, the tachlis of man is to imitate God. And that tachlis, that is really the consequence of God's unknowability, which is the Yesod Hasheni, right? Which is the Yesod Hasheni, which you spoke about. So we see clearly that halacha l'maisa is what the Rambam is communicating to us, that the fundamental philosophical basis of Judaism is to ensure the non-philosophical base of it, but rather the imitation, right, of God's ethic, of God, which constitutes ethics. Okay, now, what I think I'm going to do is, I'm going to go right to the Yesod HaShlishi. We spoke about the Yesod HaShlishi, we spoke about the order, but I think it's important to add a further point to, which is actually going to put things in more perspective. I mentioned last time that the Yesod HaShlishi, we spoke about Yesod HaShlishi, the Yesod HaShlishi speaks about the fact that the Kadosh Baruch Hu, right, does not have a guf, does not have a body, nor does he have any active movement, any type of movement. There was, and therefore, in other words, we can't describe him, in other words, you can't describe any act of God. He has tnuah, he doesn't move, he has no menucha, he doesn't rest. Nothing, he will not act in any way in which any physical object acts. So, the Rambam says, right, what about, but what do we see in the Chumash? But however, in the Chumash, we see that the Chumash describes Vayegar Hashem, right, Vayal Hashem. So how do we, it's interesting, this is in the Rambam, in the Yud Gimel Ikkarim. The Rambam understood the part of the Ikkarim is not just to understand the principle, but to make sure that this principle doesn't contradict what we see in the Torah. Right? Just like, for example, in the Rambam speaks about this too in Hilchos Tshuva, for example, in Bechira, first chapter Hay is devoted to Kadosh Baruch Hu's free will. Parak Vav devoted why some people appear not to have free will. The Rambam explains that. So here too, the Rambam says, right? In fact, actually, right? Why do we see the Torah uses a language that describes God's movements? So the Rambam says, "Kamosha Amru Dibra Torah Kolosha B'nei Adam." Rambam quotes Chazal, Dibra Torah Kolosha B'nei Adam, Ukvad Dibra Anoshim Bazah Inyan Habe. People have spoken about this. Okay? Now, what does it mean people have spoken about this? So, which people, what have they said about this? So I'll tell you exactly what they said about this. This actually appears in Perek Chavav in Chelek Aleph. Right? The Rambam here, in the, I'm assuming the accuracy of the Hebrew translation, but the Rambam says, Kavad Dibur Anoshim, right? So, Bazar Inyan Harbe. So the Rambam Moreh Nevuchim actually says what people have spoken about that. Okay? Now, what has people spoken about that? Oh, I'm sorry. Right? So therefore, the Rambam says here in Perek Chavav, Chelek Aleph, page 62, in the Schwartz edition, right? So he says, Yadu lecha amira shalahem, you all know what Chazal have said, HaKolelas is kol sugya perusha makashurim b'tchum hazeh. This has to do with what I'm speaking about. The Hainu, Masha Amru, what they have said, okay? Masha Amru, what they've said, the same language here. Dibra Torah Kolosha B'nei Adam. Torah speaks the language of man. Mashmos hadavar, mashmos of this, shekol mash b'nei Adam kula mesugam lahavinoi, u'letzayru b'achshav v'shayna. That which person are capable of understanding and imagining in their thought, at the very, at first thought, hu asher yuchas kechachil lakel yisala. This is the way God is described. But what's God described by the ways that people, but the way people can imagine things. L'chein hu mutuar, right? L'chein hu Torah, b'tarim hamatzbiyim al gashmis. For this reason, God is described by attributes which seem to be physical. Gidei lahoires al kach shu yisala nimtza. In order to show that he exists. Shekein eina homo in masig. Because people cannot understand something, right, unless they understand it physically at first. In people's opinion, something which doesn't have a body doesn't exist. Now the Rambam says too in Perek Aleph, okay, Selim v'demus, ha'anashim savru, right? Rambam here speaking about what's called Selim Elokim. People think Shetzelim B'Loshana Ivris Moreh Al Tabnis Dover Hamitar Shaloi. People think that Tzemlakim refers to a description, an image of God. Zeh Hevi L'Hakshama Gemur B'Shal Devarav, and this came to a physical understanding or anthropomorphic understanding of the pasuk Nasa Adam B'Tzimna K'Musayna. Heim Savru, they thought, right? Shakelu B'Tzuas Adam, that God looks like a man. Dainu Tabdisu Mita'alai, right? His form, his description. Umikan Nova Behecha Shegiu Lak Shamuchlat V'Yaminu Ba. For this, people thought that because of this, they could, right? They could describe God, that God is physical. They should. Umikan Nova Behecherach. And this, why was this? Why was this true? Why is this true? Shegiu Lak Shamuchlat V'Yaminu Ba, that they should see him physical and believe in him. Heim Savro. Now, this is what he's saying. What does this mean? Why was this justified? People are saying, why was it justified that that people should think that God is a body? Heim Savro. This is what I think I'm referring to. If people didn't think that God had a body, Yachishu was a kosev. They'll deny what the Torah is saying. But Yafisu was a kel. And they won't believe that God exists. In other words, people won't believe in God. People are incapable of understanding something abstract. So therefore, because of this, God was described. When people learned Psukim, people thought that God had a physical body. And the Rambam says that people thought that this is the best way you should describe God. Because if not, then in fact, actually, people wouldn't think that God existed. They'd be atheists. So therefore, it's better that you think God has a body and believe in Him than in fact think, well, he doesn't have a body, he can't exist, and therefore they would be atheists. That's what the Rambam is saying. So in other words, the fact is that Dibra Torah Koloshim B'nei Adam, according to the Rambam, right, was a necessary thing. The Rambam is saying both in Perek Aleph and Chelek Aleph, and both in Perek Chavav and Chelek Aleph, this is a necessary thing. Because if God was not described in physical, shapes and forms and bodily motion, people wouldn't think He exists. Okay?
You keep saying God, but you keep saying this passively. Basically, God is describing Himself. He has a physical form.
Well, the Torah. Well, I don't want to.
Oh, is that not?
That's what the Psukim say. Okay, I mean obviously it's from a Kodesh Baruch Hu, but this is but no, it's not God describing this. In other words, the Ram just says that they understood the pasuk as meaning that, but the pasuk obviously the Torah uses the Torah uses this language. The Torah uses language. In other words, and people based on this language actually. I mean the Ram obviously doesn't learn the Chumash like this. What I'm saying is that the fact that Torah uses this language, people explain that Torah uses this language because otherwise people would come to deny the existence of God. The Torah has to use a language that people at least believe that thing exists. That's what. Okay. Now, so we have here interesting this in the Ram, which raises a very interesting question. The question is because the fact is that if in fact the Rambam understands this to be the Yisod Shlishi, and certainly a person who would deny this, right? The person who would deny this would actually in fact be considered a heretic, be an apikaigas. So the Rambam says explicitly in Perek Gimel. In Hilchos Tshuva, it's a famous Rambam that everybody knows, and there the Rambam says explicitly that in fact if a person should in any way the 5 people are called minim, and one person person says it's a goof. So the Ravid, famous Ravid, everybody knows the Ravid, right? So why is he calling this? Rambam says, why is Rambam calling this a min? Kamagadeilim, V'tevim, Meno, people better than him went in this way, right? And they went by this Bachshava because they saw the Psukim, and in fact, actually, in the Goddess, whatever it is, some Shabbos is a Deis. So, I mean, I don't have to tell over the Torah of Reb Chaim, the Nebuch HaPikoros, the Rambam holds an HaPikoros, but the fact is that, if a person, Reb Chaim says that even a person who reads the Chumash, and in fact actually, thinks that Kodesh Baruch Hu is a body, that even though he's doing it only because he's in the Chumash, so Nebuch is an apikairos. But that's a brisk apikairos. But the fact is that it's not true. The fact is that according to Moreh Nevuchim, it's not true. The fact is not true. The fact is, according to the Rambam, the Torah wrote this way so that people would, in fact, actually, right, see a description of God in bodily form. In other words, we see clearly that what the Rambam says in the Torah, right, is just about the opposite of what he says in the Moreh Nevuchim, right? The Moreh Nevuchim, the Rambam says, a person is permitted to think of Kodesh Baruch Hu as having a body. That's what the Rambam says. The Torah is written that way in order that people should think of himself, at least the being of having a body, because otherwise they wouldn't think he exists. So in other words, why in the Mishnah Torah is the Rambam so hard line, right? And in the Moreh Nevuchim, I mean, when the Rambam is giving us an account, right, he's certainly saying that, it's permitted, it's better to think of Kodesh Baruch Hu this way than to deny existence whatsoever. And interesting too is that the Rambam actually mentions this in the Seder Shlishi, right? And he says, right? He says, right? Hakol b'derech shelo, k'mo she'ivdu b'derech b'nei Adam, u'kevad dibu anosh b'zayin harbe. People have already spoken about this, right? Already spoken about this. I think it's the Rambam speaking about here, that people have claimed that this is what they said. Now, there clearly is a contradiction between the Mishnah Torah and the Moreh Nevuchim. Clearly. Right? Right?
He's just saying, he could be saying it's better to be a min than an atheist. It's not a contradiction. It's a kasha.
Maybe he's saying that.
It's not a stira.
Maybe he's saying over there, if you prove it try to prove it philosophically.
Okay. Anyway, it could be, it could be not be. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I mean,
there's
no indication. Certainly, Rab Chaim didn't understand the
Doesn't
Rambam.
help
Yeah.
much, really.
In the Rambam, in the first chelik, in more than 30 prophets, it explains how every kind of personification of God should not really be understood like that. Regel is not really regel, but it's the mitzvah regel.
Right.
So he seems to say that you cannot think of God in physical form,
Right.
but rather physical form is supposed to.
So you're agreeing with me.
No, so
You can't think of Kodesh Baruch Hu like that. So why is the Rambam saying that? Why would the Torah write in such a way? But the Rambam is saying, why the Torah write it like this? So that people would think of it in Gashmi way. Because better if they didn't think he had a body, they wouldn't exist. On the contrary.
Maybe.
Okay, maybe everything. Let me say what I want to say, okay? I want to claim, very, very simply like this. Mankind has advanced. The Sheitas HaRambam, in my opinion, is that when the Jews left Mitzrayim, like Chazal say, halalu when Klal Yisrael left Eretz Mitzrayim, the Rambam says this in Chelik Gimel many times. We're going to see this in the Tamya Mitzvahs. When they left Eretz Mitzrayim, they taught like idolaters. They were incapable, at least the Hamanam. But I'm saying is the Hamanam was incapable the Gama was incapable of understanding God in philosophical terms. The Rambam speaks about this continuously in several places in Chelik Gimel when he begins what's called the Tamya Mitzvahs. So what I think is that the Rambam is saying the following thing, very simply. It is true when the Jews left Mitzrayim, when Klal left Mitzrayim, that it was permitted to think of God in physical terms. Because otherwise, right, they were steeped in idolatrous culture in Mitzrayim, in Egypt, and they could not have thought in God in other terms, and therefore, because of this, they would not have believed that He exists. When the Rambam is writing the Mishnah Torah, which is in the 12th century, and when the Rambam is writing the Hadama, which is in the 12th century, right? And now, we've proven, everybody intelligent knows that God doesn't have a body. It's been proven by Aristotle, which is after Yetzias Mitzrayim. So because of that, if a person in the 12th century would think that God has a body, he's a man. In other words, the point of the Rambam is that there has been a historical progression. And in fact, that is part of the Kavanas HaTorah. The Rambam in the Tamya Mitzvahs, the third chelik, which we'll speak about next time, is that the purpose of the Torah was to evolve man to a higher level of monotheism. But when the Torah was revealed at Sinai, Klal Yisrael was still steeped in idolatrous culture, and therefore it was necessary at that point to speak about Kodesh Baruch Hu in what would appear to be physical terms, so that people would believe something like that exists. Only afterwards, right? And certainly by the time of the 12th century, when no one but an idiot would think that a Kodesh Baruch Hu was a body. It's been clearly proven. Everybody knows that Kodesh Baruch Hu cannot have a body. The Rambam offers proofs for this. Then, in fact, if a person would insist that he has a body, that's a paganistic throwback of about 1,000 years, maybe more than 1,000 years, several thousand years, and therefore, he's 3,000 years, and therefore, it's considered not Ikkarim. Amen. That's what the Rambam is saying. The fact is that the Rambam was well aware of the fact that the time that he was writing in history, right, it was not, I mean, it was inconceivable that anyone but probably the biggest idiot or the biggest apikairis, a man, would think that God is a body. And because of that, if a person would think it's a body, it's a man. But, and this is what the Rambam is saying. What the Rambam says, right? Kavad dibro, right? Hakol derech she'ela. People have spoken about this. Being what? People, what is it? In other words, he says derech she'ela. What does he say when it says the Moreh Nevuchim? The Moreh Nevuchim is referring to what people thought. Why the Torah wrote that for that time? But people are talking about that. What are they spoken about? They spoke about that when they left Mitzrayim. At that point of history, it was important that people at least have a physical image of God. They would know He existed. But the fact is what? The fact is that now that's not relevant. Now it's not relevant. Everybody knows. Everybody can take any one of the terms and understands that, in fact, actually, all these actual terms can be understood allegorically. In fact, that's really what the Rambam does in the first 50 chapters of the Moreh Nevuchim. What he does is he explains to us how all the different phrases in the Chumash can be understood philosophically, and then he develops his negative theology. Why do like that? The Rambam is just making sure that anyone who hasn't heard that you can explain it metaphorically now, I'm explaining how to play the psukim, and therefore you're no longer tina shenishba. You no longer, have to understand the Chumash kipshutai, and then now we can go on and lay the foundations where this is in fact actually an axiom which is true in a true philosophical sense. So therefore, in other words, what I want to say is that I don't think that it's necessary. In other words, the kasha of the Ravid on the Rambam, right, it doesn't begin. Because the Rambam held that at his time, at least where he was at his time, right, since it was, considered, everybody, it was well known and proven that it's impossible that Kodesh Baruch Hu cannot be corporal anyway. So whoever would think like this would be a min. That's what the Rambam is saying.
The Rambam is talking about people on the 12th century as well.
Well, the Rambam, I don't think the Rambam was aware of these people.
Well, but the Ravid's kasha is still a good kasha.
The Ravid, look, if with the Ravid was living, people were thinking about it, so it's one thing. It could be a chanam. It could have all I'm saying is the Rambam would hold at his time, right? You couldn't think of a Kodesh Baruch Hu as a body. It's like, for example, it's like today. For example, what Chazal describe that, for example, that the speaking about how the sun goes around the earth. But I saw episode that Rabbi Meir, the Shiva Kaltega says, if a person would believe today that something on earth, it's a chilul Hashem. That's Rabbi Meir is quoted by saying that. I heard it from Asay's word written actually in the. Why? Because today, in days and age, you can't say something like that.
So the definition.
So what interesting is, so why does the Torah describe the sun? So I saw in the one that we published lectures up here, Rav Soloveitchik that I worked on, very simply, is that at the time that the Torah was given, people thought the sun was going around the earth. It would be ridiculous to give people 1,000 years of astronomical education. That's the way they looked at the world. The Torah was interested in communicating God's will and not God's science. So because of that, when the Torah described the sun as going around the earth. Now that we know it's not true, it doesn't change anything from like the Torah. But the fact is that there's a process, there's a historical process, right, by which people are informed of new, philosophical scientific realities, and that's what the Rambam is referring to here. Okay, I think I'm gonna stop over here. From an undisclosed place in Yerushalayim HaKodesh. Until next time, be well.
You said that you equated